At 8:07 p.m. on September 12, 1942, Kapitänleutnant Werner Hartenstein stood in the conning tower of U-156, watching a British troopship through his periscope as it zigzagged across the South Atlantic Ocean, 300 miles off the coast of West Africa. He had no way of knowing that the ship he was about to sink carried 1,800 Italian prisoners of war, his own allies. That his decision to rescue the survivors would trigger the single most controversial incident of the submarine war. That one American pilot's choice to follow orders would end Germany's humanitarian rescue operations forever, and that 1,400 people would drown because mercy became a liability. The ship in Hartenstein's crosshairs was the RMS Laconia, a former Cunard cruise liner converted to a troopship. She displaced 19,695 tons, stretched 600 feet long, and could carry thousands of passengers. Before the war, she had been a luxury vessel carrying wealthy tourists across the Atlantic. Now she carried cargo far more grim. In her holds, 1,800 Italian POWs captured in North Africa being transported to internment camps in Britain. On her decks, 463 British military personnel and civilian passengers. In her crew quarters, 160 Polish guards assigned to watch the Italian prisoners, plus 80 civilian passengers, women and children being evacuated from Egypt. 2,732 people total, most of whom had no idea they were sailing into a war zone with a German U-boat hunting beneath them. Hartenstein didn't know any of this. He saw only a large Allied vessel sailing alone through waters he controlled. Standard target, standard procedure. At 8:07 p.m. he gave the order to fire. 2 torpedoes launched from U-156's bow tubes, their electric motors leaving no wake, no warning. They crossed 600 yards of open ocean in 38 seconds. The first torpedo struck the Laconia on her port side, punching through the hull below the waterline. The explosion tore a hole 30 feet wide in the ship's flank. Seawater poured into the lower decks at thousands of gallons per second. The second torpedo hit seconds later, further aft. This one penetrated the engine room, killing the engineering crew instantly and destroying the ship's power system. The lights went out. The engines died. The Laconia went dark and began listing to port. In the holds below deck, 1,800 Italian prisoners were locked in cages. The torpedoes had struck directly beneath them. The explosions killed hundreds instantly, bodies vaporized by the blast, others crushed by collapsing bulkheads, still more drowned as seawater flooded the compartments in darkness. The survivors screamed and pounded on the locked cage doors. The Polish guards had the keys, but the guards were scrambling topside to save themselves. Many didn't even consider unlocking the prisoners. Why release enemy combatants when the ship was sinking? The Italians trapped in the flooding holds faced a nightmare beyond description. Water rising in complete darkness, hundreds of men packed into spaces designed for cargo, no way out, no hope of rescue. They drowned by the hundreds, clawing at locked doors that would never open, screaming in Italian that no one came to help. Above them, chaos consumed the upper decks. Captain Rudolph Sharp ordered abandoned ship within minutes of the torpedo strikes. The Laconia was listing 15 degrees and the angle was increasing. She would sink. The only question was how fast. The crew began launching lifeboats, but half the davits were jammed or damaged by the torpedo blasts. Of the 32 lifeboats aboard, only 16 could be launched, not nearly enough for 2,700 plus people. Women and children were loaded first. They climbed into lifeboats that swung wildly as the ship tilted. Some boats launched properly. Others capsized immediately, dumping passengers into the dark ocean. British military personnel tried to maintain order, but order was impossible. The ship was dying too fast. People were panicking, jumping into the water, fighting for spaces in boats that were already overloaded. And below deck, Italian prisoners who had escaped the flooded holds were trying to reach the surface. They climbed stairways choked with debris, forced open jammed hatches, crawled through passageways filling with water. Some made it to the deck. They found lifeboats already gone and British personnel who viewed them as enemy combatants, not drowning men who needed help. The Polish guards, exhausted, terrified, in shock, made the situation worse. Some guards were trying to help. Others were preventing Italians from accessing lifeboats, using rifle butts to beat back prisoners who got too close. One guard shot an Italian prisoner who tried to climb into a lifeboat designated for women and children. The Italian fell into the water. Other prisoners watched and understood. They were on their own. By 9:00 p.m., the Laconia had taken on so much water that her port side was submerged. The ship was rolling over. People on deck were sliding into the ocean. Those still trapped below were drowning. At 9:11 p.m., the Laconia capsized completely and sank stern first into the South Atlantic. 2,732 people had been aboard when the torpedoes struck. Approximately 2,000 made it into the water alive. The rest went down with the ship, drowned in locked holds or trapped in flooded compartments. The survivors floated in the darkness surrounded by debris, bodies, and spreading oil slicks. Some clung to overturned lifeboats. Others held onto wooden planks, life rings, anything that would float. Many had nothing but their life jackets. They waited for rescue and tried not to think about sharks. Werner Hartenstein had surfaced U-156 after the attack to observe the results. Standard procedure: verify the kill, document the sinking, move on to hunt for the next target. But something was wrong. Through his binoculars, Hartenstein could see hundreds of people in the water. Far more than a normal troopship would carry, and he could hear screaming, not in English, in Italian. He ordered his radio operator to scan frequencies, trying to understand what he'd just sunk. The answer came quickly: distress calls in Italian, prisoners shouting for help, voices calling out "Aiuto, aiuto, help, help." Hartenstein's blood went cold. He had just torpedoed a ship carrying Italian POWs, his own allies, Germany's brothers in the Axis. He had killed hundreds, maybe thousands, of Italian soldiers. The rules of submarine warfare were clear: sink enemy vessels, then withdraw immediately. Surface submarines were vulnerable to air attack. Remaining on scene after a sinking was tactically insane. But Hartenstein couldn't leave. Not like this. Not with Italian soldiers drowning in the darkness. At 9:25 p.m., he made a decision that would change everything. He ordered U-156 to begin rescue operations. The submarine moved among the survivors, pulling people from the water. Italian prisoners first, but also British personnel, Polish guards, civilian women and children, anyone who could reach the submarine. Hartenstein's crew threw lines to swimmers. They hauled exhausted men onto the deck. They packed survivors into every available space on the submarine: the deck, the conning tower, the forward torpedo room. A submarine designed to hold a crew of 52 now carried over 200 people, but there were still hundreds in the water. Hartenstein couldn't save them all. He didn't have the space. He didn't have the supplies. He needed help. At 1:25 a.m. on September 13th, Hartenstein sent a message in English on the 25-meter International Distress Band. "If any ship will assist the shipwrecked Laconia crew, I will not attack HER, provided I am not being attacked by ship or air force." I picked up 193 men, German submarine. It was an extraordinary message. An enemy submarine commander broadcasting his position: promising not to attack rescue vessels, asking for humanitarian assistance. Hartenstein was violating every principle of submarine warfare. He was making himself a target, but he was also trying to save lives, enemy lives, Allied lives, civilian lives. The message reached Allied command in Freetown, Sierra Leone. The response was silence. Britain didn't trust the message. It seemed like a trap. A German U-boat asking for help, promising not to attack, obviously a trick to lure in Allied vessels. No British ships were dispatched. Hartenstein continued rescue operations through the night. U-156 circled the debris field, picking up survivors one by one. Other lifeboats were tethered to the submarine and towed. Hartenstein distributed water and medical supplies to those he couldn't bring aboard. By dawn on September 13th, Hartenstein had rescued 260 survivors. Another 200 were in lifeboats towed behind the submarine, but hundreds more were still scattered across miles of ocean. He sent another message to BDU, Befehlshaber der Unterseeboot, German submarine command, explaining the situation and requesting assistance. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German U-boat fleet, faced an impossible decision. Hartenstein had created a humanitarian crisis that threatened Germany's submarine operations. If U-156 was attacked while conducting rescues, it would prove that mercy was a liability. It would teach other U-boat captains that saving lives meant risking their own. But Hartenstein had already committed. Survivors were already aboard. The world would be watching how Germany responded. Dönitz ordered 2 additional submarines to assist, U-506 and U-507. He also contacted Vichy French authorities in West Africa, requesting surface vessels to collect the survivors. Then he sent a message to Hartenstein: continue rescue operations but maintain security. Fly Red Cross flags. Make it clear this was a humanitarian mission. Hartenstein obeyed. He rigged a large Red Cross flag from the submarine's periscope and another from the conning tower. He moved slowly among the lifeboats, towing them toward the Vichy French ships that were supposed to be en route. U-156 looked less like a warship and more like a floating refugee camp. Survivors covered every inch of the deck. Some were wrapped in blankets, others huddled together for warmth. Women and children sat in the conning tower. Italian prisoners and British sailors shared space on the bow. For one brief moment, the war had stopped. Enemy soldiers and Allied prisoners worked together to save each other's lives. It wouldn't last. At 11:25 a.m. on September 16th, 4 days after the sinking, U-156 was still towing lifeboats and conducting rescue operations. Hartenstein had been on the surface for nearly 80 hours, far longer than any submarine should remain exposed. The 2 other U-boats, U-506 and U-507, had arrived and were assisting. Between them, they had rescued over 400 survivors and were towing dozens of lifeboats. Vichy French ships were finally approaching. The crisis seemed to be resolving. The survivors would be transferred to surface vessels within hours. Hartenstein had saved hundreds of lives despite impossible circumstances. Then an American B-24 Liberator bomber appeared on the horizon. Lieutenant James D. Harden was piloting a routine patrol out of Ascension Island, a British-held speck of land in the South Atlantic. His mission was to search for German submarines and attack on sight. At 11:25 a.m., his crew spotted something unusual: submarines on the surface, towing lifeboats, flying what appeared to be Red Cross flags. Harden circled lower to investigate. Through binoculars, his crew could see people crowded on the submarine decks. Lifeboats in tow, clear distress signals. Harden radioed his base at Ascension Island, reporting the situation and asking for instructions. The response came from Captain Robert C. Richardson, III, Sink sub. Harden questioned the order. He explained that the submarine was clearly conducting rescue operations. Red Cross flags were visible. Lifeboats full of survivors were in tow. Attacking would kill hundreds of civilians. Richardson repeated the order, "Sink sub." Harden faced an impossible choice. Disobey a direct order, or bomb a submarine conducting humanitarian rescue operations in full view of hundreds of survivors. He chose to follow orders. At 12:32 p.m., the B-24 Liberator began its attack run. Hartenstein saw the bomber approaching and immediately understood what was about to happen. He ordered the Red Cross flags struck. They clearly weren't working. He ordered survivors moved below deck to protect them from the blast. He cut the tow lines to the lifeboats to prevent them from being dragged under if the submarine had to dive. Then he waited to see if the American pilot would actually drop bombs on a submarine surrounded by hundreds of survivors in lifeboats. The answer came seconds later. The B-24 released depth charges in a pattern designed to bracket the submarine. The explosives hit the water surrounding U-156 and detonated at shallow depth. The explosions threw columns of water 50 feet into the air. The shockwaves capsized several lifeboats, dumping survivors back into the ocean. Shrapnel from the depth charges tore through people treading water near the submarine. Women and children who had survived the Laconia sinking, who had spent 4 days in lifeboats waiting for rescue, were killed by American bombs. Hartenstein had no choice. He ordered emergency dive. U-156's klaxon sounded. The crew scrambled to clear the deck. Survivors still on the submarine were pushed toward the hatches. Some made it below. Others were left on deck as the submarine began submerging. The U-boat Dove, leaving survivors scattered across the ocean once again. Those who had been on the deck when the dive began were washed off into the water. Some drowned. Others managed to swim to nearby lifeboats. The B-24 made another pass, dropping more depth charges. They missed the submarine, which had gone deep, but killed more survivors in the water. After expending its ordnance, the bomber circled once more, then returned to Ascension Island. James D. Harden would later claim he didn't see the Red Cross flags, didn't realize the submarine was conducting rescues, believed he was attacking a legitimate military target. His report stated that he observed a submarine towing objects that could have been fuel tanks or supply containers, not lifeboats. This claim was contradicted by his own crew members, who testified that the lifeboats were clearly visible, that survivors could be seen on the submarine deck, that Red Cross markings were present. But Harden had followed orders. In the military chain of command, that was what mattered. The attack on U-156 had immediate and catastrophic consequences. Hartenstein survived the depth charge attack and managed to rescue some of the survivors who had been washed off his deck, but he could no longer risk remaining on the surface. The Americans had proven that humanitarian rescue operations made submarines targets, not immune from attack. He dove and withdrew, leaving hundreds of survivors in lifeboats scattered across the South Atlantic. U-506 and U-507, which had also been conducting rescues, received word of the attack and immediately dove as well. They abandoned the survivors they'd been towing. Approximately 800 people were still in lifeboats in the middle of the ocean when all 3 German submarines withdrew. The Vichy French ships finally arrived later that day and began collecting survivors, but the rescue operation had been delayed by the American attack. Hours had been lost. People had died who could have been saved. Of the 2,732 people aboard the Laconia when it sank, 1,400 plus died in the sinking or drowned in the days afterward. Only 1,083 survived to be rescued by French ships. Among the dead, over 1,000 Italian POWs, hundreds of British military personnel, dozens of Polish guards, and multiple women and children. The Laconia incident became one of the most controversial events of the submarine war. Admiral Dönitz was furious. Hartenstein had risked 3 submarines trying to save enemy lives, and the Allies had responded by attacking a clearly marked humanitarian operation. It was proof that mercy was a liability, that following the laws of war made you vulnerable to enemies who ignored those same laws. On September 17, 1942, Dönitz issued what became known as the Laconia Order. No attempt of any kind must be made at rescuing members of ships sunk. Rescue runs counter to the rudimentary demands of warfare for the destruction of enemy ships and crews. The order went further. U-boats were forbidden from rescuing survivors, from towing lifeboats, from providing medical assistance. The age of humanitarian submarine warfare was over. Sink the ship, leave the survivors, move on. The Laconia Order would later be cited as evidence of war crimes during the Nuremberg trials. Prosecutors argued that Dönitz had ordered the murder of shipwreck survivors, that the order was equivalent to instructing U-boat commanders to commit atrocities. Dönitz defended himself by citing the Laconia incident. He had tried to conduct humanitarian rescues. The Allies had attacked his submarines while they were doing so. The Laconia Order was a response to enemy action, not a war crime. The tribunal ultimately found Dönitz guilty of other charges, but the Laconia Order itself was deemed a legitimate military order given the circumstances. He was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, far less than other German commanders received. But the real consequence of the Laconia incident wasn't legal, it was operational. After September 1942, German U-boats stopped rescuing survivors. When they sank a ship, they left men in the water to drown. No medical assistance, no lifeboats, no mercy. Allied submarine commanders took note and responded in kind. American submarines in the Pacific adopted the same policy. Sink the ship, leave the survivors, move on. The submarine war became total. No quarter given, no prisoners taken, no humanitarian exceptions. Werner Hartenstein continued commanding U-156 for another year. He sank additional Allied vessels, following the new doctrine, sink and withdraw, no rescues, no mercy. On March 8, 1943, U-156 was detected by American aircraft east of Barbados. The bombers attacked with depth charges. U-156 was damaged but managed to dive. The submarine was never heard from again. She likely sank with all hands, lost somewhere in the Caribbean. Hartenstein and his entire crew, 52 men, vanished. The man who had tried to save 1,800 lives died at sea, killed by the same forces he had fought against. His final resting place is unknown. His submarine has never been found. The survivors of the Laconia spent the rest of their lives processing what they had experienced. Some of the Italian POWs rescued by Hartenstein sent letters to his family after the war, thanking the German commander for saving their lives. They described him as honorable, compassionate, willing to risk his own life to save enemy soldiers. British survivors had more complicated feelings. Hartenstein had sunk their ship, killing hundreds of their comrades. But he had also saved their lives afterward, treating them with dignity and providing medical care. How do you reconcile being torpedoed by a man who then pulls you from the water and gives you his own food? The Polish guards who survived felt guilt for decades. They had locked the Italian prisoners in the holds. When the ship was hit, they had fled without unlocking the cages. They had left 1,000+ men to drown in darkness. Some guards claimed they tried to help, but couldn't find the keys in the chaos. Others admitted they had simply run, choosing their own survival over the lives of prisoners. The women and children who survived, the ones who had been on the submarine deck when the American bomber attacked, never forgot watching depth charges explode around lifeboats. They had survived a German torpedo attack only to be bombed by their own side. One survivor, Doris Hawkins, was 18 years old when the Laconia sank. She spent 4 days in a lifeboat before being rescued by Hartenstein's submarine. She spent several hours on the U-boat deck, treated kindly by German sailors who gave her water and blankets. Then the American bomber attacked, and she was thrown back into the ocean. She was rescued again by French ships and survived the war. But she never forgave the American pilot who had bombed clearly marked rescue operations. In interviews decades later, she called it murder. James D. Harden, the American pilot who bombed U-156, maintained until his death that he had followed orders and attacked a legitimate military target. He claimed he didn't see Red Cross flags, didn't realize the full scope of the rescue operation, believed he was preventing a German submarine from escaping. His crew members contradicted this account. Some stated publicly that Harden knew exactly what he was attacking, that the discussion in the cockpit before the bomb run included explicit recognition that survivors were present. But Harden was never court-martialed, never reprimanded, never faced consequences for the attack. He had followed orders. In wartime, that was sufficient justification. The debate continues to this day. Was Harden a war criminal who bombed humanitarian rescue operations, or a military officer following legitimate orders to attack an enemy submarine? The truth is probably somewhere in between. Harden saw a German submarine on the surface. He received orders to attack. He attacked. The fact that the submarine was conducting rescues, that Red Cross flags were flying, that hundreds of civilians were present, all of that was secondary to the military objective. This is what total war does. It eliminates the space for mercy. It turns humanitarian rescue into a tactical liability. It forces impossible choices between following orders and following conscience. The Laconia incident proved that in total war, trying to save lives can get you killed. After the war, the British Admiralty conducted an inquiry into the Laconia sinking. The report was classified for decades. When it was finally released, it revealed systematic failures. The Laconia should not have been sailing alone through submarine-infested waters. The Italian POWs should not have been locked in caged holds below the waterline. The Polish guards should have been trained on emergency evacuation procedures. The ship's lifeboats were insufficient for the number of people aboard. No escort vessels were provided despite the ship carrying high-value prisoners. The report also noted that British command had received Hartenstein's distress message offering safe passage to rescue vessels, and had chosen not to respond. No British ships were dispatched because the message was assumed to be a trap. This decision likely cost hundreds of lives. If British vessels had arrived earlier, more survivors could have been rescued before the American bomber attack forced the German submarines to withdraw. The report's conclusions were damning. The Laconia disaster was preventable. Better planning, better security, better response, all of it could have saved lives, but the report changed nothing. It was classified, filed away, forgotten. The lessons went unlearned. In 1963, a memorial was erected in Liverpool to commemorate the Laconia victims. The inscription reads, "In memory of all who died when RMS Laconia was torpedoed on 12 September 1942. It doesn't mention that half the dead were Italian POWs locked in cages. It doesn't mention that a German U-boat commander tried to save them. It doesn't mention that an American bomber attacked the rescue operation. The full story was too complicated, too morally ambiguous, too difficult to fit into the simple narratives of heroes and villains that war memorials require. But the story deserves to be told in all its complexity. 1,400 people died when the Laconia sank. They died because a German submarine torpedoed their ship. They died because they were locked in holds with no escape. They died because rescue operations were delayed. They died because an American bomber attacked a humanitarian mission. They died because war destroys the systems that might have saved them. Werner Hartenstein tried to do the right thing. He tried to save lives, enemy lives, Allied lives, civilian lives. He risked his submarine, his crew, and his career to rescue people who were drowning. And the consequence was an order forbidding all future rescues. The Laconia incident is a tragedy without villains. Hartenstein followed his conscience. Harden followed his orders. Dönitz tried to balance humanity with military necessity. All of them made choices that seemed reasonable at the time, and 1,400 people drowned anyway. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube to share this with more people who need to hear it. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you the complicated truths of history every single day. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. These stories don't fit simple narratives of good versus evil, but they're true and they matter. 1,400 people died in the South Atlantic in September 1942. Some were killed by German torpedoes, some by American bombs, most by the simple fact that in total war, mercy becomes impossible. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering the Laconia and for understanding that history is never as simple as we want it to be.